Okay, to learn more about using these SQL data sources, controls, and like the grids and the views, we're going to create some of these from scratch. So I'm in my chapter 16 project, so I have my app data here with my Northwinds database MDF file. I should also have my connection here to my SQL server. So I'm going to go, whoops, not under new, I'm going to go project, add new item. I'm going to go into C#, of course, and under web, make sure I have web form created, and I'm going to create a new form here. So maybe I'm going to do a DataGrid first. So DataGrid test recorded. I'm going to switch to design view here and bring up my toolbox. Where is that toolbox? So again, we had been using standard stuff. Now we're into the data controls. So I'm going to have the data controls open here, and I'm going to go down to the SQL data source and drag that into my grid here. And then right away I'm going to go to this quick format stuff and configure a data source. And one that's available right by default is the Northwinds MDF. I'm going to start with that, and I'll come back and we'll reconfigure that in a little bit. So that'll be the Northwinds MDF. I'm going to hit next here. Now I want to make sure that this data source creates the SQL commands needed. So if I'm just going to be displaying data, it just needs a select command. But if I'm going to allow it to edit and delete records, I'll need those those SQL commands also. So here's it. It's creating the select command to display the data. I can select different values. Now, right by default, it's an alphabetical list of products, and this is actually a query. And if I select this query, it will not let me do some updates and that sort of stuff. So I want to make sure I switch this from alphabetical list of products to the actual product table here. So I want the products table, not a query. And again, it's grabbing the product name. So again, here's my SQL command, select star from products. So it's grabbing it right from the table. And I could select certain fields. I'm going to leave all the fields open for this data source because I might use the same data source for a couple different things. Now, right now it's only got my select command, and I'm going to want to add some more commands. So I want to go to advanced and make sure I say generate the insert, update, and delete statements. And I can do optimistic concurrency also here. We're not going to talk too much about optimistic concurrency. That's just if multiple people are using the database at the same time. But it's generally you can do that and it'll work out fine. But we do always want this, or often want this, because I'm going to want to enable editing and updating and deleting. And so I want it to automatically generate those SQL commands also. Okay, now I can go next. I can test my query if I want to make sure everything's working. It's just grabbing this data from this area. Looks fine. I can finish it up. So that configures my data source for me. And again, it kind of replaces all that code we used to write to just tie up the data source and create SQL queries for it and things like that. Now I'm going to pull up a grid view and put that over here. So here's my grid view, and I'm just going to tie the grid view to this data source. So again, right away in the quick menu here, I can choose my data source and I can select my SQL data source. Now, if you're doing this a lot and we didn't do it here, you probably want to start renaming your SQL data sources like SQL products, so you know what field or what table you're grabbing and that sort of stuff. But right now we're not going to change the names of this. And so again, with this, we're just going to quickly configure it. So again, I've just quickly configured the data source and selected that. Don't have to do that anymore. So now if I just run this, I should display that data. So here's all the data, all the fields, and it displays a whole bunch of information. I want to do some things like enable paging and things like that for this. So let's just do some quick formatting of this this information. So I can do things like enable paging, enable sorting. Let's just do those to start with. And what that will do, oops, I have to start this. Let's see if those, yeah, those held. Okay, let's run this again. Now I'll see multiple values here for multiple paging, and again I can change this paging, and the titles up here have changed, so now I can actually sort on any of these column headings. Okay, now let's do some other things with this. So we turned on paging. We can also change it. Right now it just numbers the pages. I can do next and previous and things like that with the paging. So to do some more control with the paging, I'm just going to click on my data grid and go down here in the properties. And so I can set the page size. That's how many records are shown on the page. And then under pager style, I can change that. So for example, I can switch, oops, where's my, make this a little bigger. So under pager style, there's a type, yeah, I looked under pager style, I'm sorry, pager settings, that's what I want. And under settings, I can change this to like next, previous, first, last, if I want. Right now it's using greater than or less than as my first, so I can actually change these words like first, last, the next page I can just say next, and previous page I can just say previous. I can control some things with the paging here. I'm also going to enable editing and deleting of these records. So now let's run this again. So now I'll see I have a next page and previous page because I, again, by default, I've changed that format and I've changed them from the greater than, less than signs to these. I've enabled editing here, so now I could go back to my first page. I can go here and edit this. Changes all my all my fields to text boxes, and in fact I've already edited this, so I'm going to edit it back to 10. Now for that effect, edit to take effect, I have to make sure I click update, and that'll update that information stored in the database. And again, I can also delete a record by clicking that, and then I also have to verify that delete. So those are some of the things you can change. We can also go in and we can configure edit the columns, what columns we're adding, and the format of the columns, and we can edit templates. There's lots of configurations we can do with this sort of data grid, which we began to see. Well, I'm not going to do too much of that configuration in this because it depends a lot on where you want to do, but you can look up and look at these different characteristics and modify each of the products. For example, you can go in for product name and make sure the header, the text says things like product name. Sometimes you'll have like a header, a column name will be L name, and you want to change that to last name or something like that. So you can change a lot of the characteristics of individual columns here in our database. Let's talk a little bit more about this data source. We quickly step that up. Let's go in and reconfigure that now that we have this working. I'm going to go to my data source, again, do my quick selection stuff and configure data source. And right now it's my MDF file, and I can see the connection string that's out there. And it is storing that connection string in my web config file. Now I can do a new connection here and change it. So I can change my data source. Right now it's the SQL Server database file, so that's a local file inside my project, an MDF file. I can also go back to my SQL Server and connect up to that. Right now something's happening in my SQL server. It should show my server name up here, and I'm not connected to it. I noticed I had two different versions of SQL Server, and one of them I removed, and now I'm having some issues there. So hopefully you can see your SQL Server connection here, and I can't, and you can change that. But I'm going to show you another way, a fast way of connecting up to a database like a SQL Server database. I'm actually going to go into my code. I'm going to delete this information here in my script, and now I'm going to go into View SQL Server Objects. So in my SQL Server, I have my databases, I have Northwinds here, and I have my product database. If I want to do a quick grid that works the products database, I can just click on that and actually just drag that table onto my form, and it will create by default a grid with the data source set up for that. So just by in any of these databases, you can grab the data table and drop it right on your form. It'll quickly create that information for you. And now I can run this, and here's that information. Again, I can go in and configure that this data grid in the same way as I did the other one. What this does then is adds another connection string. So before we had the Northwinds MDF, it adds a new connection string here. And in fact, if I go look in my web config file, I'll see a new connection string, Northwinds connection string 1. And again, if I want to change that to say something else, I can edit that, and it'll show up in the right places. So I can adjust this connection string any way I want. So that's how you can get a quick connection string and a good connection to it, and then you can actually use this connection in when you create future forms. Similarly, from the MDF view, if you go in your file and you open your MDF file and you grab one of your products here or one of your tables here, you can drag that off and that'll create that. In fact, in the web config file, that is how I created this Northwinds MDF file, is simply by dragging that off earlier for another test project. And then I just went in and renamed it so it would be clearer what that was tied to. Okay, so next recording we'll look a little bit more at these detailed forms, the form view, and how those work.